Welcome back, and if you are new here, stay with me for the next 8 minutes, because what I am about to lay in front of you is not what you will find on any mainstream news channel right now. Not because they don't know it, but because the numbers are so large, so alarming, and so connected to each other that presenting them in full would require admitting something that no government, no central bank, and no primetime anchor wants to say out loud. This crisis is no longer just a war, it is an economic earthquake, and the aftershocks are just beginning. Less than 1 hour ago, Goldman Sachs, one of the most powerful financial institutions on Earth, quietly updated its U.S. recession probability to 30%, not a forecast, not a model projection buried in a quarterly report. An official update issued today, because the numbers coming out of the Middle East are now moving faster than the models were built to handle. And Goldman Sachs is actually the optimistic one. Moody's Analytics has its recession probability at 48.6%. Wilmington Trust is at 45%. EY Parthenon at 40%, with a warning attached that says, and I am paraphrasing directly, those odds could rapidly rise in the event of a more prolonged or severe conflict. The conflict is prolonged, it is severe, and it is deepening by the hour. So let's go through it carefully, precisely, because this is not a story about missiles and interceptions anymore. This is a story about $5 trillion and who is going to pay for it. Let me start with the number because context without scale is meaningless. When this war began on February 28, 2026, when U.S. and Israeli jets launched surprise strikes on Iran, global stock markets were carrying approximately $110 trillion in total market capitalization. Within the first 10 days of the conflict, global stocks had fallen 5.5%. That is not a percentage, that is a number. That is $6 trillion in wealth erased from global markets in 10 days, according to Bloomberg's direct market tracking. $6 trillion gone in 10 days, and that was the beginning. Since then, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell over 400 points on March 2nd alone. The S&P 500 dropped. Asian markets, which are structurally more exposed to Middle Eastern energy than Western markets, were hit hardest. The Nikkei, South Korea's Kospi, India's Sensex, all deep in the red within days of the conflict beginning. The reason is not complicated. It is actually very simple, and it connects to everything that follows. Oil went from $67 per barrel on February 27th, the day before the war, to over $111 per barrel within 1 week. That is a 66% increase in 7 days, the fastest surge in oil prices in over 40 years, faster than the 1973 Yom Kippur War, faster than the 1979 Iranian Revolution, faster than the 1980 Iran-Iraq War, faster than any energy shock in modern recorded history. And oil does not just affect gasoline prices. Oil is the input cost for manufacturing, shipping, aviation, agriculture, chemicals, plastics, fertilizers, heating, electricity generation. When oil moves 66% in a week, everything that depends on oil, which is to say everything moves with it, that is how $5 trillion goes at risk. Not in one place, everywhere, simultaneously. Here is the part that financial analysts are genuinely afraid of, and here is why they are afraid of it. The global economy was already walking a tightrope before February 28th. Inflation had been coming down slowly, painfully from the post-COVID highs of 2022 and 2023. Central banks in the US, Europe, and Japan had raised interest rates aggressively to fight that inflation, and the rates were only beginning to come down. The Federal Reserve had paused its easing cycle. The European Central Bank was preparing for measured cuts. The global economy was fragile but stabilizing. Then the war hit. And it hit in a way that created what economists have a specific word for, a word that carries enormous historical weight, a word that describes one of the most destructive economic conditions a modern economy can face: stagflation. Stagflation is the combination of two things that normally do not happen at the same time: rising inflation and falling economic growth. Normally, when growth slows, inflation falls with it. Normally, when inflation rises, growth is still running. Stagflation breaks that relationship. Prices go up, growth goes down. And the policy tools that central banks use to fight one of those problems make the other one worse. If you raise interest rates to fight inflation, you slow growth further, which is already weakening. If you cut rates to stimulate growth, you make inflation worse, which is already rising. There is no clean solution. That is why stagflation is so feared. The Council on Foreign Relations published analysis this month identifying the exact mechanism. When oil rises sharply, it simultaneously pushes consumer prices higher inflation while squeezing corporate margins, reducing industrial output, and slowing economic activity recession, both at the same time. No policy lever fixes both. Goldman Sachs has now postponed its forecast for the next Federal Reserve rate cut from June to September. The European Central Bank, on March 19th, postponed its planned rate reductions entirely, raised its 2026 inflation forecast, and cut its GDP growth projections in the same announcement. The IFO Institute in Germany, one of Europe's most respected economic research bodies, has warned that Germany and the Netherlands are at high risk of recession. The ECB itself warned that energy-intensive economies, specifically naming Germany and Italy, could be pushed into technical recession by the end of 2026 if the maritime blockade persists through the summer. UK inflation is now expected to breach 5% in 2026, the highest projection in Europe. Chemical and steel manufacturers across the UK and EU have already imposed surcharges of up to 30% on their products to offset surging electricity and feedstock costs. The ECB used a specific phrase in its most recent assessment. It warned of the potential for, and I am paraphrasing, permanent deindustrialization in some sectors. Permanent, not a temporary disruption. Permanent structural damage to European industrial capacity. Because of a war that started 28 days ago, every oil shock in modern history eventually ended because supply found alternative routes. The 1973 embargo was lifted. The Iranian Revolution disrupted production, but the wells eventually reopened. The Iran-Iraq War was brutal, but the Strait stayed operationally open. This situation is different, and the Council on Foreign Relations published a direct assessment of why. The CFR's senior fellow, Brad Setzer, wrote, and I am paraphrasing closely, "The oil crisis will only end when traffic through the Strait of Hormuz resumes. That leaves Washington with two options. Neither is good. Option 1, persuade Tehran to reopen the strait, which requires making concessions that Iran will use as a public relations victory, an outcome that the current U.S. administration entered this war explicitly to avoid. Option 2, escalate further, force the strait open militarily, which risks losing naval vessels, which potentially requires deploying ground forces, which would extend the conflict by weeks or months, which would drive oil prices higher, not lower, during the military operation itself." Goldman Sachs modeled all three scenarios directly. In their most optimistic scenario, the strait reopens within 30 days. Brent crude averages $71 per barrel in Q4 2026. Global commercial oil inventories drop by 6%, or 617 million barrels. Manageable. In the mid-case scenario, disruption lasting 60 days, Brent crude surges to $93 per barrel in Q4 2026. Inventory impact expands to nearly 20%, or 1.8 billion barrels. Policy responses, strategic petroleum reserve releases, alternative routing can offset only about 30% of the shortfall. In the extreme scenario, 60-day disruption combined with long-term damage to Middle Eastern production capacity, Brent crude reaches $110 per barrel in Q4 of 2027, not 2026. 2027, a full year from now, still at crisis levels. We are currently in day 28. The 60-day threshold arrives on April 28th. Goldman Sachs, in the same report, made a statement that got almost no coverage outside of financial media. Their analysts wrote that the core question of this conflict is not whether the U.S. military can win tactically. It is when the Strait of Hormuz can be reopened, and they noted that answer remains unknown. There is a dimension of this crisis that is almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage, and it is the dimension with the most dangerous long-term consequences. The Strait of Hormuz does not just carry oil. It carries the chemical inputs that global agriculture depends on to feed 8 billion people. The CFR's analysis identified the specific numbers. Gulf countries account for roughly 45% of global sulfur supply, 50% of global urea exports, 53% of global sulfur exports, 64% of global ammonia exports sent to Asia alone. These are not industrial chemicals, these are fertilizer inputs. The raw materials from which nitrogen fertilizers, the single most important agricultural input in modern farming, are manufactured. Morningstar analyst Seth Goldstein told Reuters directly, nitrogen fertilizer prices could roughly double from 2024 levels. Phosphate prices could increase by approximately 50%. The United Nations World Food Program issued a warning this month, not a concern, a warning that supply constraints coinciding with the Northern Hemisphere's spring planting season could lead to decreased fertilizer usage, which lowers yields for staple crops. And the crops named specifically were wheat, rice, and maize, the three crops that feed the majority of humanity. The Fertilizer Institute stated directly that nearly 50% of global urea and sulfur exports transit through the Strait of Hormuz. The disruption to the helium supply critical for semiconductor manufacturing has added a supply chain dimension that extends into the technology sector. Semiconductor production requires helium for chip manufacturing processes. Gulf states are significant helium suppliers. That supply is disrupted. And on top of all of this, a Financial Times investigation published this week found that $580 million in bets on falling oil prices were placed in financial markets just 15 minutes before President Trump published his statement about postponing strikes on Iran on March 23rd, a statement that caused oil prices to fall temporarily. That discovery has triggered calls for a formal investigation into potential insider trading at the highest levels of this crisis. $580 million. 15 minutes. Someone knew what Trump was about to say before he said it. Here is the critical thinking layer, because the official statements and the private assessments of the world's major financial institutions are not the same thing. Publicly, Goldman Sachs says recession probability is 30%. That sounds like a warning, but not a crisis. But Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, one of the most respected voices in global finance, said something publicly this week that went largely unreported. He said the fallout from the Iran war, and I am quoting him directly, is going to last, even if there's a resolution tomorrow. Even if there is a resolution tomorrow. The economic damage already done to supply chains, to inventory levels, to inflation expectations, to corporate investment decisions, to shipping routes, to agricultural planning cycles does not reverse the moment a ceasefire is signed. The Chatham House assessment published last week was blunt in a way that institution rarely is. It stated directly the Eurozone economy would probably contract in Q2 and then flatline over the second half of the year. Flatline. Not slow growth, not below-trend expansion. Flatline. For the Eurozone, whose largest economy, Germany, was already in industrial decline before this war began, flatline GDP combined with 5% inflation is not a technicality. It is a political crisis. It is a social crisis. It is the kind of economic environment that historically produces political realignment, social unrest, and the collapse of governments. The IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, warned on March 9th that if the war is prolonged, it poses an inflationary risk on the global economy. She said, "We are seeing resilience tested again by the new conflict in the Middle East." Tested by a conflict that was sold to the public 28 days ago as a targeted operation to degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities. The operation is ongoing. Iran has a new supreme leader. The missiles are still flying. The strait is still functionally closed. And the IMF is warning about inflationary risk at a global level. Here is where the deep analysis arrives at its conclusion. And it is not a comfortable one. The United States and its allies currently have two options. Goldman Sachs identified them. The CFR confirmed them. Every serious analyst studying this conflict has arrived at the same framework. Option 1 is a negotiated resolution, getting Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for concessions, probably on sanctions, probably on the nuclear file, probably involving some form of public acknowledgement that Iran's security interests matter. That deal exists. The framework for it is knowable, but making it requires the current U.S. administration to accept an outcome that looks, in any honest reading, like the war it started achieved less than it promised. That is a political cost that no administration willingly accepts unless the economic cost of not accepting it becomes impossible to ignore. And here is where the clock becomes relevant. The WTO said this week that if oil and gas prices remain high for the rest of the year, global GDP growth falls by 0.3%. That sounds small. It is not small. At the scale of the global economy, 0.3% is trillions of dollars, and it compounds. California gasoline prices surged above $5 per gallon in the second week of March. The Federal Reserve, which entered this crisis already dealing with inflation above its 2% target, now faces a situation where rate cuts, which American consumers and businesses desperately need, would accelerate the very inflation that the oil shock is already driving, the stagflation trap fully set. Option 2 is military escalation, forcing the strait open by direct confrontation with Iran's naval and drone capabilities in a geographic environment specifically designed by Iranian military planners to favor the defender. The IRGC has spent decades optimizing its asymmetric naval capabilities for exactly this scenario. Fast attack craft, anti-ship missiles, drone swarms, sea mines, midget submarines, all of it concentrated in and around a 24-mile choke point where geography severely limits the maneuverability advantage of larger surface vessels. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is the most powerful naval force on Earth. It cannot simultaneously protect every tanker that needs to transit Hormuz. The math does not work in a sustained confrontation. So two options. Both unattractive, both with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate military and diplomatic picture. And a $5 trillion exposure sitting on the table. Growing every day, the strait remains closed. Growing every day, oil prices remain elevated. Growing every day, the fertilizer supply chain stays disrupted. Growing every day, the European industrial base absorbs surcharges that push it toward what the ECB quietly called permanent damage. 28 days into a war that was presented as a targeted, defined operation with clear objectives, oil up 66% from where it started. Global stocks down $6 trillion from peak. Recession probability at 30% from Goldman Sachs, nearly 50% from Moody's. The ECB has halted rate cuts. UK inflation heading toward 5%, Germany facing recession. European chemical and steel industries absorbing 30% surcharges. Fertilizer prices potentially doubling. The UN warning about food security for crops that feed billions. 580 million in suspicious trades 15 minutes before a presidential statement. And less than 1 hour ago, Goldman Sachs updated its recession probability again, because the numbers keep moving. Lloyd Blankfein said the fallout is going to last even if there is a resolution tomorrow. There is no resolution tomorrow. The stated objectives: regime change in Iran, elimination of its missile and nuclear threat, restoration of regional stability, remain unachieved. Iran has a new supreme leader. The missiles are still flying. The strait is still functionally closed. Oil is still above $100. What is $5 trillion? It is the accumulated weight of every supply chain disrupted, every cargo ship rerouted, every factory absorbing a surcharge, every family paying more for food and fuel, every central bank frozen between two bad choices, every pension fund watching equities fall, every emerging market watching its currency weaken as the dollar strengthens on oil flows. It is not one number. It is the sum of 10,000 separate economic decisions, all bending in the same direction at the same time. And the people sitting in the rooms where these decisions are actually being made, not the press conferences, not the flag background statements, not the official briefings, those people know something that mainstream coverage is still struggling to say clearly. This crisis has moved beyond the point where military success alone can solve it. The economic clock is now ticking alongside the military one. And right now, nobody is certain which one runs out first.